so it occurred in October of 2018, but the area is so remote that it essentially sat there for over 6 months before anyone was aware of the problem. And it was when we first became aware of it, it was actually during an ongoing the 2019 migration season, and we discovered very quickly that fish were delayed, and essentially the area is totally impassable to salmon. We calculate that just over 100,000 cubic meters of rock material fell off the cliff face into the river. A portion of it was basically eroded and moved downstream, but a substantial portion of the rock is still situated at the base of the cliff. Unfortunately, it also happened. Another unfortunate element of the location was it was a point that was already a natural constriction. There was this sort of this little toe of rock. We call this the east toe. I'll refer to it regularly. Is right across. So it was already a natural constriction, and then essentially we nature filled it in with rock material. This created a 7-meter high waterfall, and the velocities and turbulence just made it totally impassable. I should have actually paused and just let you know. So what I'm going to try to do, the structure of the presentation is I'm going to try to take a chronological approach. I'm going to walk everyone through sort of what events starting in 2019, the effects of our efforts to try to remove rock material and other mitigation measures. We tried to deal with the impacts to the fish, and focus on the construction components, the monitoring activities, as well as the alternative fish transport systems we've had to implement to assist fish when they are blocked, as well as the offsetting emergency conservation enhancement program that we've initiated to try to offset some of the loss of spawners from the slide. And then with that, then I'll wrap up with sort of a forecast out with regards to what we believe the next steps are going to be, as we still have a considerable problem in front of us. Anyway, back to sort of updating everyone. So immediately upon finding out that this was how big the problem was, the federal and provincial governments partnered with First Nations to create a joint trilateral response. So essentially, it was a partnership between the federal government, the provincial government, and critical First Nations, particularly 2 local First Nations to the area, the Haibar First Nation and the Shwekam First Nation. In addition, another major organization was the Upper Fraser Fisheries Conservation Alliance and the Fraser Salmon Management Council. We formed what's called a Unified Incident Command System, which is sort of an internationally known emergency response system, whereby it's a very structured approach, where people can get trained on how to respond to almost any kind of incident in a multifaceted way, as long as everyone uses sort of this incident command system. So it lets a lot of people come together and integrate quite quickly to try to resolve problems. We also identified a joint executive steering committee to oversee the program from a senior government level, as well as an advisory First Nations leadership panel, and then struck quite a considerable number of technical groups. This is a photo of the incident command headquarters in Lillooet, using a provincial Ministry of Forests office. We are very fortunate in that within the federal government, we have the Coast Guard, which is very familiar with ICS, and within the province, the BC Wildfire Service is also exceptionally expert at ICS, and with those 2 agencies sort of really helping steer a lot of the response team. It turned out to be an effective strategy to quickly take this emergency and try to put together a comprehensive response. We identified quickly that there was 4 main objectives. We had to ensure that everything we did was was conducted in a safe manner. We identified our top priority was to reestablish in-river passage. We understood we had to have a comprehensive monitoring program consisting of biological, hydrological, and geotechnical assessments, and then we had to do offsetting, which was to find ways to help fish. And the two main ways, if we couldn't get them through the slide area, was to assist them over through mechanical means, or put them into an emergency enhancement program. I'm going to quickly go through this slide, but essentially the plan is to walk you through what we did in 2019, the adjustments that we made and conducted in 2020, what was done last year in 2021, and then forecast what the plans are for 2022. But essentially, 2021 was the year, 2019 was the year where our only option was to move fish by helicopters. I think many of you might have seen some of the footage, photographs of that work, or the reports, as well as trying to scale the area and make it as safe as possible, as well as begin the process of developing access. At the very end of 2019 is when we hired a contractor to come in and lead the major construction phase. 2020 was really about completing the road access and then getting into heavy construction, rock removal, in-river rock removal. And then when we continued to expand our alternative passage systems with whoosh, or as people sometimes refer to it as the fish cannon. And then by 2021, this is when we were really moving well into the plan to build a permanent fish ladder. But as I'll get into in more detail later, this work was never completed, and we have actually taken a pause as we determine whether or not we do want to continue down that pathway or come to another strategy to develop a permanent solution for the slide site. A quick review of the priority salmon stocks that we're focused on. The stocks at the very top are the ones that are of most critical concern, particularly after 3 years. We've narrowed down and understand these are the fish that are most in need of assistance. So the early arriving spring 5-2 Chinook, they are really the ones that are the most susceptible to impacts from the slide, just because of their very early timing, as well as the earliest arriving sockeye, primarily early Stewarts, followed the Bower and Taseko, and to a lesser degree Nadina. On the right, you can see that many of them are listed as endangered or threatened under the Committee on the Status of Wildlife in Canada. So we have highly vulnerable populations, highly impacted by the slide site. It's not a great situation at all. So moving into our immediate actions in the summer of 2019, we implemented fish capture methods to try to get fish through the slide site. We did know that nothing was getting past, so the only option was to provide mechanical assistance. We established 2 fish wheels, as you'll see on the left. If people aren't really familiar with them, the force of the river spins these baskets, and they basically scoop up fish and deposit them into holding boxes. These fish are then taken from the boxes, moved into a punt, moved to shore, where then they're loaded into helicopter transport tanks. On the right, we would use jet boats to do basically seining, and then do basically a purse seine, and then from there rush the fish quickly into these holding tanks, helicopter transport tanks, one by one, and then they would be slung under helicopters, flown from below the slide to above the slide, and then about a kilometer or so above the slide, and released back into the Fraser River. So that was the main emergency fish response, but then combined with that was an intensive monitoring program. That consisted of 2 components. One was we established sonar systems above and below the slide to detect fish moving into the slide area, as well as help determine if fish that were able to get through, as well as monitor the progress of the fish that would move by helicopter. The other way was to insert radio tags on fish, release them back to the river, and watch the tag watch those tagged fish through picking up their the transmissions from their antenna. And on the bottom right is one of these receiver stations along the Fraser River upstream of the slide site. So this graph just basically shows a time frame for that first season. So from the left, when we first became aware of the problem, to a few weeks later when we were starting to you see the little bumps here. This is when we were first starting to capture fish and then get them into helicopters and move them past the slide site. And then our program was constantly expanding and getting more effective. We were building up and building up, moving more and more fish. And then at a certain point, just as we were getting quite good results with the helicopter movement, the hydrograph and the red line dropped below a critical point here of about 1700 CMS, at which point it then became possible for fish to get through on their own. So they could basically the velocities at the slide site dropped sufficiently, the fish were all of a sudden able to get through on their own. So from at which point we then discontinued our helicopter transport system. As I explained earlier, the next part was to try to improve passage conditions at the slide site. Right after, almost one of the initial measures was to make sure that we could get to the base of the cliff safely, and to do that, we had to get onto the cliff and have any and all loose material safely secured or removed. And this essentially meant a large team of scalers had to descend down the cliff face, methodically cleaning every surface and every loose piece, using a whole number of different systems to take anything that could move and forcing it out. So as you can see here, a few teams on the right are on this very large cliff, doing everything they can to make it safe for people below. This took, I'm going from memory, it was probably in about 5 weeks, 6 weeks of work, at which point then they could descend down to the base of the cliff. And here's, it's on the two top photos are pictures of the base of the cliff. And as you can see, there's sort of just this large rock garden of material that has been deposited. And what we, because we didn't have any heavy equipment, everything we were trying to do in 2019 was help fish through by establishing better passage conditions. So we try to basically by hand tools and some pneumatic tools punch through small pathways through the rock from which you'd get better hydraulic conditions, and avoid big jumps like this, and help the fish move through. And it was really exceptionally hard work. And the right here, you can just see in a whole bunch of these crew members, these scalers have now become basically rock breakers using hand tools to try to do everything they can to create these little micro channels for the fish to migrate in. We did experiment in the bottom left. You'll see an Alaska style steep pass fishway. It's basically a channel with a bunch of baffles, and unfortunately they weren't successful. Just the difficulty of working in the river. They were relatively small, so they could be handled, but at the same time, working in these ever-adjusting conditions and getting them situated just right and putting them in it just meant it was a never-ending task that never really succeeded. So after a few tries, we did abandon that approach. Moving on, the real problem was just that we had major velocity barriers and exceptional turbulence and drops that just did not allow the fish to successfully get through. On the right, you can just sort of there's a picture across the river from the west side over looking directly eastwards to this east toe, and you just get a sense of the scale of the problem that these fish were trying to migrate. There's no green water, there's no great currents or pathways for the fish to go through. On the bottom left, there's a bit of a velocity heat map showing just the different velocities that there's some marginal areas, but then you'd still have these large rock jumps that the fish would act as physical barriers. I don't know if this is going to play. I've tried to insert a bit of a video. It should only be a few seconds long. I'll give it a shot, and if it works, great. If it doesn't, it really is just a video portrayal of what I've tried to show in the last couple of photos. I hope that played. Anyway, so after at the end of the season in 2019, and we had most of the remaining fish able to get through the slide area because the water dropped. We then understood that the next reasonable approach was to get into major construction and do everything we could to vastly improve the overall condition of the river. So we went through an accelerated tendering process under emergency circumstances, hired a major construction firm, which many might have heard of, Peter Hewitt and Sons, sort of an internationally renowned engineering and construction firm. They were the successful bidder, and their strategy was to come in and quickly get to the bottom of the cliff and bring in heavy equipment and try to access as many of the mid-channel rocks as possible. On the left here is sort of a bit of an oblique view looking upstream of the work they did. So on the bottom left, they had to, under the yellow line is this the road that they had to punch through. And as you can see, it was a very steep terrain that they had to cut through. They had to sort of make in the purple, a bit of a prep area. We put in more rockfall protection mesh at the top of the cliff. There was an attempt to put in a high line and ability to cross from west to east to access the east toe. And the part of the plan, of course, was to remove the east toe and then get out and put these fingers out and get to as many mid-channel rocks as possible. On the right here, you can see they've gotten the road pushed through the prep area down in this area. And now they are going out and putting fingers out to individual rocks in an effort to then put drilling crews on each of these rocks. So you got 1, 2, 3, 4 fingers at this point. But as you can see, they can't even get into the mid-channel. It's just the velocity is too high. So with that, they then started drilling and then blasting rocks. As you see here, there's a picture of a before and after picture of them getting onto this rock. You can see by the size of these individuals here, just the scale of these boulders, and then peppered it with drill holes, inserted in explosives and let it go. And as you can see here, this is with the rock removed, and then what they would do is do the same with each one of these big boulders, and then they would just pull the fill material back. As it relates to the east toe, we used a number of different systems to get these drill machines on the east toe, and they then peppered the east toe with and just in a whole series. I can't remember the number of drill holes, but it took weeks to. It was I think it was in the order of about 100 separate drill holes. And they actually had to do it in two lifts, sort of an upper section, and then go in and do a lower section. And to the right, you can actually see one of the explosions blowing up a large portion of that east toe. So we're now into sort of by this time, we're into March of 2020. However, in the meantime, we've been analyzing the results of the work that's been done to date. And on the left here, you see another heat map. And while it's modeled out that a large part of this mid-channel, the rock that they can access is still, has been removed, that the weir, the remaining rock up here that they can't get to, and some mid-channel rocks mean that we're still going to have two critical velocity barriers that are going to mean, even though after all these rocks are removed, we're still going to have a problem getting fish through at high water. So reluctantly, we decided we actually had to go back in and try to come up with a mitigation system, which is an alternative fish passage system to get fish through this critical area. That actually meant putting material back into the channel to create a working platform. And the image on the right was a design of a system we had. We had proposed a planned temporary fish ladder, as well as this was the first time we determined we would try using a whoosh, which is a pneumatic or air pressure system that would pull fish and then deliver them under air pressure to a point above the slide site and release them. We decided the best place to do this work was right at the slide site itself. This was the point of constriction. This is where the fish were going to be delayed, and they would be searching for an alternative passage point. And the prediction was, and then proved to be true, that the fish would find their way into our fish ladder system and make them available for movement. So with some rapid work done through that winter and early spring, we designed this passage system. But in place of the nature, that fish ladder that I showed in the previous design, we realized we didn't have the time to construct a proper fish ladder. So we designed what was called a nature-like fishway. It's using strategically placed boulders. We could create a set of basically riffles and pools from which the fish could move in a sort of stepwise fashion and migrate upstream. You'll see in the top right here, this is a picture from the United States where they've strategically placed boulders throughout this riffle area, and the fish can basically move from burst through fast areas and then get into holding areas and just make their way up into the quieter water. Similarly, this is of a fish, another example from an actual fish ladder where they put external baffles on, creating quiet water, which would then allow fish to burst through into the next holding area. So taking these two designs, we came up with the idea of creating what we call the nature-like fishway, which in order to build all this, we had to, one, create we had to actually go back in and start installing a rock back into the river, one, to create a work platform for the base of our pump system, and then more fill to create this nature-like fishway. So this schematic shows what we thought was when we thought we were still building a temporary ladder, but we still use the same structure to overlay it with the sort of rock garden that would provide for natural passage at moderate flows. Added to that, we everything was experimental at this time, and we needed to have every option available to us. We also prepared a truck transport system, which is a more traditional way of moving fish. So fish were not using the nature-like fishway because the water was too high and the fish pump was not working the way we wanted. We had to ensure that we had the ability to move fish by truck. So we came up with this backup to that. In the top left here, this is a picture. It's actually taken from 2021, but it's very much like the nature-like fishway that was built in 2020. But as you can see, we carefully laid large. It's hard to tell because of the scale. Very large boulders in a uniform sloping manner, and as water levels go from about 3,000 to about 4,000 CMS. It actually ended up being quite successful. It did help in many ways to allow fish to make their way volitionally through the slide area in 2020. I'll get into some more details later about some of the problems we had later. But this picture on the right here is actually the release site. So those fish that we moved by truck would be transported to what was a place called French Bar, approximately 1 kilometer to 1.5 kilometers upstream of the slide, and then released this French Bar here, released back into the Fraser. I'll get into some more details later here, but this is part of our enhancement program. We had a DNA selection process before we determine which fish we would keep or return to the river for Chinook. So I'll get into some details about that later. The pump itself, the fish cannon or the whoosh pneumatic fish pump, did work, but not quite as well as we would have liked to, but not because of the system itself, but because of the site constraints. In the picture here on the left, we constructed a ladder. The fish would, while searching to get past the slide, they would we would pump water through these pumps into the upper portions of the ladder. The water would flow down. Fish would key in on that water and swim into this ladder system, into a steep pass section, and then into the whoosh system here. On our best days, we had 3,000 fish enter the system and then move into the whoosh. It was we were actually really pleased how successful or effective this ladder was. Unfortunately, 2020 was a very high water year, and we were regularly flooded. I think we had to decommission everything and move off site twice because of high water flooding of the work site, as you can see in a picture here on the right. On the left, in this other picture, we have a more oblique perspective of the whoosh. Fish would come up the ladder, go up this steep pass here. This is called a scanner box, which basically would measure the fish's dimensions, length, and girth, and determine based on its size and which one tube would not work for all size of fish. You had to basically have different tubes for different size fish to make sure that there wasn't too much of a pressure differential, too little pressure differential for the fish. So we actually had to establish 6 different tubes. So this scanner box would select which tube the fish would go through, and then they would be pushed by air through these tubes and then deposited upstream. The challenge we had was because we were doing this with very little time, we were not able to suspend the tubes nearly as far above the slide as we would have liked, which resulted in many fish falling back. They'd hit the water, they would land in the water, and then they would not have time to orient themselves and continue migrating upstream, and they would get swept back downstream. So while many fish were moved by the whoosh, unfortunately, in terms of our passage goals being met, we did not achieve them. Late in the season, we did try putting one experimental extended tube in, but unfortunately, it was so late in the season, the results were inconsequential, and as such, we determined that we would not use this again going forward. But it was an impressive system. It let the fish move through without any physical handling by anyone. It was all volitional on the part of the fish. And it was the speed at which they were transported through the tubes was quite fantastic. It was I think it was my memory is about 5 meters a second. So in just a few moments, it would travel over 250 meters. Okay, moving on, and I apologize. I think I'm probably talking too slowly here. I'll maybe try to accelerate because we're still only in 2020. This would basically, the blue line indicates the hydrograph in 2019, which was quite moderate, but held fish for extended periods. We improved the river condition quite considerably in 2020, but we had much higher water. So for anything above this line meant no Chinook were moving. The water was just too high. So, but what happened was we had an extended period where Chinook couldn't migrate. And then we had basically the water discharge just plummeted. So we went from a situation where no fish were moving to a point where they could easily get through the slide site. So the period of time that we actually needed to be helping the fish in 2020 was very short, only approximately 2 weeks in duration. We had determined in 2020 that based on site conditions, overall passage conditions, and concern for these conservation stocks, that we would construct a fish ladder, a permanent fish ladder, similar to what you see at Hell's Gate. And so we spent quite a bit of time designing fish ladders. These pictures here are just basically schematics showing the different fishway designs and velocities to ensure that what we designed was going to have maximum fish water speeds that would not exceed fish burst speeds. Similarly, we were looking that this is the top end of the ladder, and we wanted to understand what the velocities would be at different discharge elevations on the outside of the ladder, with hopes that during more moderate flows, fish wouldn't necessarily need the ladder. They could still pass on the outside. In 2021, we did a lessons learned exercise, determined what went well and didn't go so well in 2020, and started designing our 2021 program. We have been successful the last 2 years using fish wheels as a capture system. It's not a high capacity system, but it is a consistent fish capture system. We also determined that transporting trucks past the slide site was successful, and therefore we would use a combination of fish wheels and small trucks to move fish. But similarly, we also knew this ladder was able to move up to capture and attract up to 3,000 fish a day. So we developed another system, and we modified the ladder and put a lift system in to discharge fish into larger transport tanks. And all these trucks would then move the fish above the slide. One of the challenges we had was that the roads were exceptionally tough in this area, and the province undertook to try to do a vast upgrade of all road systems in the area to allow us to be able to more safely and securely move fish during all conditions, including inclement weather. So they spent months upgrading all our road systems and made substantial improvements. So the bottom left here is just an example of some of the work going on to give us those better road surfaces. So 2020 was a tough year because of very high water that held fish back and still resulted in high mortalities, particularly for early stewards. 2021 was quite the opposite. We had very moderate flows. So while we had planned both years to help fish, in 2020 we needed to help fish because there was a lot of delay. In 2021, there was almost no delay. By the time the fish got to the slide site, because of the work that had been done the previous years to improve passage conditions through rock removal and the Nature Light Fishway and other measures, almost all fish got through, and we had just under 2 million fish moved through the slide site, including a very large run of early stewards, relatively large run compared to the 2 previous years, and over 1.7 million sockeye. So overall, we did not need actually to move fish, and that was even though we were ready to do so, it was a success in that we did not actually need to do that. I'll try to accelerate a bit. I realize time is marching on. I didn't mean to make such a long presentation, but some of the upgrades we did in our radio, in our monitoring program, as we expanded our radio telemetry through the slide site, we had to have a better understanding of where fish were really getting stuck, where the problems were. So these blue bands basically identify the basis of our radio telemetry system, so we could more carefully monitor the more fine movements of the fish and to more precisely indicate where problems lay. I did say I was going to speak to enhancement. In the next few slides, we're going to give a quick update on enhancement, but I'll go through this relatively quickly if I can. Right away, we understood the early stewards sockeye were going to be heavily impacted, and we right away initiated an enhancement program that unfortunately, because of all the challenges of the site, after all that effort, we only had about 20,000 fry that were able to be released in 2020. But we did rely heavily on one of our little hatcheries, a sockeye-specific hatchery in the Lower Fraser called Inch Creek, to run our program that year. By 2020, we were more prepared and ready, and we did both the Chinook enhancement program as well as another early steward program. We released just over 100,000 Chinook fry into 12 different streams in the Upper Fraser, as well as 110,000 early stewards. So we went from 20,000 to 110,000 early stewards. Back to, if you remember that picture, I said, look at those round tubs at French Bar. What we had to do was we had to make sure that the Chinook we were intercepting were genetically identified, so make sure that we weren't just mixing and matching different stocks, different populations. That would have been a disaster. So we held fish for a few days, collected DNA samples, sent them down to our lab in Vancouver, got the genetic results, and identified which fish were the populations we were going to be targeting for enhancement, the priority ones versus the ones we were going to release back to the river. So Yeah, here we just have a number of pictures of some of the releases that were going on in, these would have been the 2021 releases of the 2020 fish. By 2021, we determined that Chinook actually, even with extended delays, the upgrades to the site meant that they were not going to be nearly as impacted by delay as sockeye, early sockeye were. So we changed tactics, and in 2021, we only collected Chinook from natal streams. So we still targeted populations that were most vulnerable to impact by the slide, but we collected those fish natally. So we essentially did nature did the genetic sorting for us. But then we still did have to conduct a downstream early steward program because they were still they're the most susceptible of all the fish to delay and impact. I should pause here and say that, this has been a fantastic cooperative program between DFO and quite a number of First Nations. It's been a fantastic experience for, I think, everyone with regards to the collaboration and cooperation in every way. We've had First Nations from all over the Fraser and even outside the Fraser, such as the Okanagan Nation, brought expertise in. So we've had a lot of very experienced biologists and technicians from quite a number of First Nations groups partner with us. And when I say partner, I truly mean that we sit in technical planning teams, we design our operations collaboratively, we have joint decision making. It's really been an effective process. This goes for the transport as well as the enhancement components of the program. 2021 did result in, again, quite an expansion of Chinook. We went from just about 100,000 fry to almost 340,000 Chinook. And our early steward went from just 110,000 to about 1 million. So just every component of the program has continued to build. As well, the number of facilities we're using expands. Where we have the Quesnel River Research Center, as well as hatcheries owned by Takla Nation and the Causley, the Spruce City Wildlife Association is participating, as well as 4 DFO hatcheries. So we've called on a lot of different facilities to support our enhancement program through this expansion. Going forward, we're now approaching our 4th season. We still have a partial barrier, and we are still planning to put in place alternative transport programs in order to be prepared to move fish if and when we see delay. We're going to fall back on the pieces of the program that we have been able to have the most reliance in. The fish wheels are going to play a critical role catching fish for us. And we will be doing a combination of short haul release to the French bar site, as you see in the bottom right, as well as we're now going to incorporate a long haul. So some fish will be actually moved from the slide below the slide if they're delayed up and released above Williams Lake. So all these planning activities are occurring right now and getting ready for install in late June and operation in July if need be. This slide just is intended to speak to what I've said a few times: is early steward sockeye still, early times sockeye, particularly those early stewards, are a high priority for us. They're the most vulnerable to the slide, as well as a critical status, conservation status. But going forward, in terms of coming to a permanent solution, where as I said earlier, we step back from the construction approach to make sure that based on new information about passage conditions and assessing the improvements we have made to site, what really is the best way to solve the problem in front of us, and make sure we install a system or design a system that is appropriate to the new information. So we're bringing on a professional facilitation company to basically lead us through what's called structured decision making, where you essentially assess all of your management objectives, and consequences, values trade-offs, draw on existing information and identify where your information gaps are, try to answer them, bring in the best available professionals, subject matter experts as you can, and basically analyze this problem from a multifaceted perspective and try to see if you can come to a consensus-based decision with regards to how this program should go forward. We do hope to have, it is underway already. We are holding meetings right now, and we do hope to have this completed by June to help inform us with regards to what we should do with our next construction season in the fall winter of 2022/23. With that, that's the end of my presentation. We do have, I've got here a number of sites people can go to get more imagery or information. And I can leave it up here and just open it up to see if there's any questions. Thank you.